Hello, my name is Adrian van Breda. I'm a professor of social work at the University of Johannesburg. This video lecture is part of a module called Behavioral and Environmental Change that is part of the Masters in Clinical Social Work. And this is one of the collection of lectures in this module. This particular lecture is focused on the theory of psychodynamic practice. I'm not in this lecture really speaking about practice itself, so I'm not going to talk about how to do psychotherapy or psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Rather, what I want to cover in this lecture is the theory that underlies psychodynamic practice. We think it's critically important for a clinical social worker, in other words, social workers who are engaged in advanced clinical practice, to not only master the techniques of the practice models that they are using, but also to really understand in some depth the theory that underlies those models. A technician is not what makes one an expert, and a technician is not what makes one a master. In order to be a master or an expert in clinical practice, you do have to understand what informs and guides that practice. And this is particularly true in psychodynamic therapy because the theoretical grounding is so rich, deep, and diverse. And hopefully through this lecture you'll begin to get a sense of the wide spectrum and the diversity, and yet also some of the overlaps in theoretical concepts that inform this practice. As you understand that theory, you are empowered and in a better position to decide how to work with each individual client, with their unique personality, their unique cluster of relationships in the present moment, and also their unique history. And so you begin to shape your practice, drawing on your understanding of the techniques, not merely on the mastery of the practice of technique, to be suitable for this specific client. And so this is what we're covering in this lecture. But in addition to that, even if you don't intend and think you will never practice psychodynamic psychotherapy, the psychodynamic theory remains important for all practice because essentially all practice, all social work practice, is in some way grounded in or derived from psychoanalysis. Freud's early work laid the foundation for all counseling that was to come. And the cognitive behavioral therapists and the person-centered therapists in many ways were trained in psychodynamic theory and then chose to move away from psychodynamic theory towards something else. And so their theories are either informed by psychodynamic theory. We see this in Rogers' work when he talks about symbolized and unsymbolized experiences that are very similar to conscious and unconscious experiences in Freudian terms. Or they are a reaction against psychodynamic theory. So task-centered social work moves away from long-term therapy to short-term therapy, away from talking towards tasks. Cognitive behavioralism is focused again on short-term therapy, very much working with the conscious mind rather than the unconscious. These newer practice models that came after Freud are either guided by or influenced by Freud, or they are a reaction against Freud. And thirdly, understanding psychodynamic theory is important because it always underlies and informs our understanding of psychiatry. And so as we think about people with psychiatric disorders, those disorders are informed in many ways by our understanding of psychodynamic theory. And so whether or not you intend to practice as a psychodynamic therapist, understanding psychodynamic theory, which is what we're doing in this lecture, is absolutely vital to become a well-rounded practitioner. Gosh, there are so many wonderful textbooks out there on psychodynamic theory and practice. It's really hard to say which one is good and which ones are bad. I certainly would not want to make such a categorical statement. However, amongst the many, many books in my library, I find that this textbook by Alessandra Lemma, called Introduction to the Practice of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, is a really lovely, usable and accessible textbook for somebody who is coming into psychodynamic theory for the first time. She writes in a very down-to-earth way. The actual layout of the book I've always found very easy to look at and read. She uses a lot of case examples to illustrate sometimes complex theory. In addition, what Lemma does is to draw on the wide range of psychodynamic theories that are available. And so she draws on Freud, she draws on object relations, on self-psychology, and many other of the more contemporary approaches to psychodynamic practice. So if you were going to go out to buy one textbook as your sort of core or cornerstone textbook for psychodynamic theory, I would suggest that this would be a really good place to start. However, there are many other wonderful textbooks, and many of them cover the same kind of material that I'm going to cover in this lecture, and similar to what Lemma covers in her book. So you'll see in some of the slides that I'm referring to Lemma 2003. That's the first edition of her book, which is the one that I actually have. The second edition came out more recently, a few years ago. On this slide, I'm presenting to you 4 of the most important characters, certainly not the only characters, but definitely 4 of the more influential characters in the broad family of psychodynamic theorists. Freud has the big picture because he is really, unquestionably, undoubtedly the father of psychodynamic theory and practice, and so his influence over this field continues long after his death. And even those of us who don't practice a Freudian approach to psychodynamic therapy are still influenced by Freud. Some of the important people that came after him were Melanie Klein, who is the mother of object relations, Kohut, who is the father of self-psychology, and Winnicott, who, in addition to developing numerous insights that are distinctive to him, also found ways to articulate psychodynamic theory in a way that was very accessible and that many of us find very useful today. There are, of course, many other people, including Anna Freud and others, who have played an important role in this field. We can't go through all of them, but these 4 are 4 that I will be giving a bit more attention to in this lecture, and especially Freud and Klein. So we start with some of Freud's theories and thinking. These are most likely concepts that you have learned in your undergraduate psychology training. If you did a couple of years of psychology, which all social workers do, you would have learned something about these his basic theories. So this was his first kind of theoretical formulation of understanding the human mind, and it's called his topographical model. Topographical refers to maps, basically, and the idea of sort of how high above sea level and how low below sea level something is. And so it's this idea almost like a mountain that he's describing as the human mind. So at the top of the pyramid, we have what he calls conscious. And I always advise students, just be careful not to write conscience, because conscience is sort of the little moral voice in your head that tells you right from wrong. It's your sense of morality and values. Conscious is those things of which we are aware. And so at this very moment, as you're listening to this presentation, what's currently in your conscious is what I'm saying to you and what you're seeing on the screen. That is currently conscious because you're busy thinking about that right now. You might also be conscious of some feelings in yourself, such as a bit of irritation that you're having to watch this video, or perhaps interest or boredom, or all kinds of other emotions that you might be aware of. That's also in your conscious. And you may also be thinking, even while you're listening to this presentation, about some other things that you have to do. You might be thinking about the house that needs cleaning, or an assignment that you need to write, or about travel arrangements that you're making. And so as you are conscious of what I'm saying, you may also be conscious of various other thoughts going on in your mind. Anything that is presently in your mind at this moment is what we call the conscious. The second level, which you can see is a bit larger, is the pre-conscious. And the pre-conscious are all those things that you are not aware of right at this moment, but if you just think a little bit about them, you'd be able to draw them into your conscious. So if I asked you, for example, to think back to what you ate for supper last night, you'd probably be able to remember what you ate last night. If I asked, what were the last things you thought about or felt just before you were dropping off to sleep yesterday, you may well be able to go back in your memory and your mind and reimagine what you were thinking or feeling last night as you were dropping off to sleep. Those things are readily accessible in the pre-conscious. Similarly, I could ask you to think about some experiences that you had in your childhood. What are some of your early childhood experiences? And those also would be in your pre-conscious, because if you can call them up, then they are in the pre-conscious. If they are easily accessible to you, and a little bit of thinking or reflection can draw them up, then we say that's the pre-conscious. So it's quite a large repository of memories and feelings and experiences that is fairly accessible to us if we put our mind to it. And then the bottom part of the pyramid, which is the largest part, is what Freud calls the unconscious, and this is what he was really interested in. The unconscious refers to all of those aspects of our life experience that are not accessible to us if we just think a little bit about it. So if I was to ask what memories you have or what happened to you when you were 1 or 2 years old, you would probably not be able to remember very much. And even if you kind of work quite hard on trying to think and remember, you would probably not be able to draw up many of those memories, if any. All of those memories, however, are stored in your mind. They are all located in the unconscious. So these memories, these experiences, these feelings, these sensations, these desires, these images, sounds, they're all recorded and stored in our hard drive, if you want, but they're not accessible to us just by thinking. One would need to use specific processes, which is what psychodynamic therapy is trying to do. We would need to use those specific psychodynamic processes in order to draw these memories that are hidden down underneath in the unconscious and draw them up through the preconscious and into conscious awareness. So this topographical model remains really important, and I suppose in some ways the key take-home message from this slide is that very little of our life experience is in the conscious. There is a bit more sitting in preconscious that we can recall quite easily, but the majority of our life experience is stored in the unconscious and is not accessible to us except through specific pathways. So let me say then a little bit more about the unconscious, because this is for Freud the kind of the beginning and the end, the most important part of his theory and his therapy was to understand what's going on in the unconscious. It is a system of mind with particular problems. We don't really think of the unconscious as a place in the brain. It's not like that there's at the top there's the conscious, and then somewhere over here is the preconscious, and then down on the bottom is the unconscious. We don't really think of it like that, although modern brain research might be showing that they are, or has been showing certainly, that they are that there is a lot of empirical evidence to support Freud's theories. But really, when Freud was speaking about the unconscious, he was not thinking so much about the brain per se, as rather a system of mind. So a system in the thinking and the awareness of human beings. We quite often write unconscious UCS. If we want to abbreviate it, unconscious is UCS, and conscious we abbreviate to CS. And you'll see me using these abbreviations on some of these slides. So he speaks about the unconscious as being dynamic. And by dynamic, he's not referring to, it's like a very charismatic speaker in that sense. He's using the word dynamo as the word for change. So the unconscious is constantly changing and moving and driving. It is the energy. We use the word dynamo very often to refer to the engine that spins around and drives a machine. And so the unconscious, in Freud's view, is the constant source of motivation. The motivation that we have to do things, what prompts us to behave and react in certain ways, largely comes from the unconscious. So the unconscious is constantly in the business of making things happen. Even though we're not aware of it, It in fact is a powerful driver of our current behavior. He also explains that the unconscious is the result of repression. And repression is a kind of blocking off of psychic material from consciousness. I quite often think of repression as a pushing down of things that we are aware of. They get pushed down, down, down into the unconscious. And so that they're hidden down beneath a layer, there's almost like a floor under which all the unconscious material is stored. And that is where unconscious material lies. So repression is this effect of pressing down psychic material, blocking it off from consciousness into the unconscious. And what do we find in the unconscious? We find sexual and aggressive drives. Sexual drives Freud refers to as libido. Aggressive drives he refers to as thanatos, which is sort of a death drive. We also find in the unconscious all of the defense mechanisms, of which repression is perhaps the key one. And then we find a whole range of memories, feelings, experiences, images, and sounds that cannot be dealt with by the conscious. So these are repressed very often as a result of trauma, but in fact most things get repressed because we simply cannot be conscious of that many things at the same time. The mind is not capable of being aware of everything all the time. Our minds are not sufficiently developed to do that. And so much of what we have experienced in life and much of what we know has to be pressed down into the unconscious in order for us to focus on a fewer number of things and experiences, and that as much as that we can actually manage in the conscious. And so in many ways, memories and feelings and historical experiences all get stored in the unconscious, almost like a hard drive or an external hard drive. They get sort of downloaded there, and that's where they get stored and saved. So that what we're working on right now, if you think of a computer metaphor, the documents that are currently open on your screen, those are the ones that we work with, and all the rest are lying quietly in the background. So Freud's topographical model was that triangle that we looked at the beginning, with conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. And subsequent to that, he developed his structural model, which is the id, ego, superego model. And these two models fit together very nicely. And so the iceberg model, which is what we see on the screen now, the iceberg model is a model of this topographical model in many ways, because what falls beneath the water is largely the unconscious, and so the unconscious is all at the bottom, the big substantial part of the iceberg, where the conscious is quite small actually in comparison. But now overlaid onto that model, topographical model, in this picture here, we have his structural model of the id, ego, and superego. So let's start with the ego, because the ego is, as you can see on the top right of the model, is the part of the mind that we are currently aware of. So those things that we are currently aware of is what is lying here in the conscious, and that's the part of the mind in which we have contact with the outside world. You'll see that most of what is in the conscious, this part of the iceberg here, is the ego. And then there's a small part here on the side of superego, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. So the ego is what Freud would call the psychological component. It's the part of our mind that we are aware of. It's the psyche. It's the thing that we, when you and I are engaging with each other, a lot of what we're working with is the ego. It draws on what we call the reality principle, and the reality principle has to do with what's happening in the real world. And so the ego is very concerned with what's true and what's not true, what's real versus what's not real, what we can see versus what we only imagine, what we know versus what we might not know, or what we might believe that's not necessarily true. This is the reality principle. It helps keep us grounded in the real world in which we live. And it helps us navigate the real world, the world of relationships systems, rules, governance, policing, and so on. It uses what's called secondary process thinking, which has to do with principles like reality testing, decision making, impulse control, frustration tolerance. These are all secondary process thinking, and this is the job of the ego. The job of the ego is to help us engage effectively with the world around us. And so even though we, for example, we might become so angry with somebody that we really want to hit them, and maybe hit them really, really, really hard and hurt them badly, the ego is the one that will help remind us that actually that's not really part of normal human society. And so we may hold back a little bit on that because the ego is the one who helps us understand how the world works, and to behave in ways that are rational, calm, reasonable, and so on. We can see, though, that part of the ego lies here in what we're calling the preconscious, and we can see that some of the ego here is also located in the unconscious. And so the ego really straddles the three levels of Freud's topographical model. Underneath the ego, which is the largest part of the mind, is the id. And this lies down here at the bottom. You can see that the entire id lies in the unconscious. The unconscious starts over here, and we see that the id is entirely unconscious. And that's what we were saying earlier. So you can't actually just, if I ask you to think a little bit about what's happening in your id right now, you wouldn't just be able to think about it and remember or collect some ideas from your id. All of the material in your id is lying buried. It's buried quite deep, and just by thinking about it now, you would not be able to access it. So if you think that you're accessing something from the id at this moment just by thinking about it, what you're probably doing is that you're accessing something from the ego in the preconscious. That's probably what it is that you're accessing. The id is driven by the pleasure principle, and the pleasure principle essentially is that we instinctively strive to achieve pleasure and to get away from pain. So the natural instinctual urge of human beings, and this is true of animals as well, so in a sense this is the sort of evolutionary part of our brain or our mind, is that we try to escape from pain and discomfort and distress, and we try to move towards things that feel pleasurable. And so this is the drive of the id, is to avoid pain and to achieve pleasure. It relies on primary process thinking. And it's always hard to kind of explain exactly what primary process thinking is for me, but I have found that the closest that I can get to the experience of primary process thinking is when you're dreaming. So I want you to think about times when you've dreamed, and you're sort of aware that you're dreaming, or maybe you can remember the dream when you wake up. Can you think of times where you've been in a dream where things happen that seem very logical and sensible? They seem to like work very well. So you were here, and then all of a sudden you were there, you were talking to this person, and then all of a sudden that person became some other person. And in the dream, all of that seems quite reasonable and sensible, and it kind of makes sense. And then when you wake up and you're wanting to write down or tell somebody else about this dream, all of a sudden it gets confusing because no, but I was there, but then all of a sudden I was there. How did that happen? Or I was talking to my father, and all of a sudden now I'm actually talking to my lecturer. How did that happen? And so it no longer makes sense. So these ability of the id is that things that are not logical, things that are not possible, can feel very logical and very possible. And so this is how the id operates. And so the id is able to think about one person when in fact it is intending some other person. And so one thing can stand for something else. Something can be symbolic of something else. And the id is quite comfortable working in this sort of fluid fantasy way. So when you remember kind of weird stuff in your dreams, that's probably about as close as we're going to get in everyday life to having a little bit of insight into what the id is and what primary process thinking is about. So you'll see in the white letters at the bottom of the screen that the id is also the biological component. Freud certainly thought of this, and we now increasingly understand this to be the more reptilian part of our brain. So in evolutionary terms, the very early, sort of underdeveloped, primitive part of the brain. It contains all of the instincts, the same kind of instincts that animals have, but for us, particularly including eros and thanatos, which we spoke about earlier. Eros is a sort of a sexual drive, a drive to procreate and to love and to reproduce. Thanatos is a drive towards death, so it's an aggressive, violent drive. And these are associated with the unconscious mind and the id. And so the impulses that we have, the aggressive impulses or the sexual impulses that we have, all stem from the id. They come up, they're quite in some ways primitive drives. And we'll see on the right there the words unconscious, difficult to retrieve material well below the surface of awareness, and then all psychic energy originates in the unconscious. The very last part of the mind that we want to have a look at is the superego, which we see extends on the left-hand side of the diagram all the way from the conscious through the preconscious and deep down into the unconscious. And the superego is the social component of the mind. It's the part of our mind that tells us right from wrong. And right from wrong, and not in absolute terms, but rather right from wrong in the context of our society. So in our society, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. So the superego may look different. So that, what the superego is saying to people in one country or one community might be very different from what it would be saying in another community or country. In a way, it is the moral imperatives. So it's the internalized moral conscience of a person. And this is where we do use the word conscience to refer to the superego. So when you think of your conscience telling you don't do this because it's wrong, or you ought to be doing that because that's right, or that's what's expected of someone like you, those moral imperatives, Freud says, emerge from the superego. He also describes it as the ego ideal. In other words, it is the part of our mind that tells us what we ought to be in the ideal world. If we were fully developed and a fully kind of actualized human being, the superego is the one that will describe that for us and that motivates us to behave in more pro-social ways. So culturally, for example, the philosophy and the values of Ubuntu in many ways are rooted in the superego. That would be that part of the brain that tells us that our relationships are really of primary importance to us, and that our compassion and our sharing and our mutuality in our relationships with other people is of primary importance. That would be coming from the superego. In addition, for those of us who are religious and believe in God, when we feel like we're hearing God's voice and God is telling us what is right from wrong, or we feel like the Holy Spirit is prompting or pricking our conscience, Freud would say that's the superego as well. So in many ways, the superego equals God in Freudian thinking. We spent quite a long time on this one slide because this structural model is really very important and central to Freud's theory. And so you may want to go and read a little bit more about it if you feel that you haven't quite grasped it from this conversation. So just a quick and slightly fun summary of Freud's structural model. The id is the one that says, I want it now, I want it all. We think of Freddie Mercury's great song. The superego is saying, you can't have it, it's not right. And so the superego is that moral conscience that's often wagging its finger at us. And the ego is the one that is the reality testing and saying, I need to do a bit of planning to get it. And so we'll be looking kind of thoughtfully and carefully at what can I do to achieve what I desire. The next important part of Freud's contribution to psychodynamic theory is his model of psychosexual development, which works really through the first 5 years of life. That's the main focus of his work. And you should remember these, I'm sure, from psychology undergraduate. The stages are oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. The oral stage is the first year of life, where there's a lot of focus on the mouth and the pleasure that children get, or that infants get, from eating, as well as vocalizing. So those of you who have or have children, or who have nieces or nephews, you think back to when they were a little baby, they would reach the point where they would begin to make all kinds of funny noises, cute noises, as they were playing with the sounds that their mouth was able to make. But a lot of the child's early experience is about drinking milk. And so the mouth becomes the center focus of their psychosexual development. Then from about age 1 to 3, the focus shifts from the mouth to the anus. And so we call this the anal phase, and this is really a focus on feces, on poo. And so there is, on the one hand, the pleasure of holding poo in and retaining poo, and then the also pleasurable experience of expelling poo, in other words, of actually getting poo out of your body. The phallic phase, which is ages 3 to 5, is the classical phase when we think of Freud, and this is the pleasure that children get from touching their genitals, and this refers particularly to the Oedipal phase in men and the Electra phase in women. And so the Oedipal complex, as we refer to it, is for boys the desire to have a sexual relationship with their mother on the one hand, and then on the other hand to see the father as a sexual rival and a desire to kill the father in order to claim the mother. And for girls, it's the opposite. It's an attraction and a desire to engage sexually with their father, and on the other hand to get rid of their mother so that they can claim and own their father. The latency phase, which runs from roughly ages 6 to 11, which is sort of primary school, is when the child identifies with the same-sex parent. In other words, there's a sort of switch. They resolve the Oedipal or Electra complex, and they begin to identify with the parent of the same sex. Freud calls this the latency phase because he thinks that not really very much is happening developmentally in this phase, so he actually gives very little attention to it in his writings. And then the ages 12 to 18, which are sort of teenage years, is the genital phase, and this is where the focus is on heterosexual attraction. Now, we can be very critical of these phases because, as you can see from what I've written and what I've said, it's extremely heteronormative. It assumes that heterosexual development is the normal and healthy development and will then define any other kind of sexual attraction. So, for example, a homosexual or bisexual orientation, or an asexuality, a non-interest in sexuality, all as being the result of a dysfunctional development in the psychosexual development. And so he would explicitly have pathologized all psychosexual development that was not heterosexual. So we call that heteronormative. It's about saying that heterosexuality is normal. That's what's normal, and everything else is a deviation or deviant. But we do still find a great deal of value in the oral, anal, and phallic phases and understanding what happens to adults and what happens to children when they become adults. So a person who had complications during the oral phase, for example, continues into adulthood with an oral fixation. They kind of get fixated or stuck at the oral phase, and so in adulthood they continue to express challenges and difficulties related to the mouth. And that would include disorders of eating, for example, so anorexia and bulimia in particular. And the anal phase, the anal phase has to do with control, so control over the body, so the ability to hold poo in and then choose when and how to release it. And so people who get fixated in the anal phase would have issues around control, and so it's funny how blank one can go. And so people with control issues, such as obsessive compulsions, would have an anal fixation. The phallic phase is really where people have psychosexual complications, and so any kind of sexual dysfunction would emerge from the phallic phase. As I mentioned earlier, in the latency phase, Freud didn't really see anything exciting happening, and so for him that was like a really boring phase of life, primary school. And in high school, really all that was happening was that young people we're beginning to be attracted to people of the opposite sex, and again, running from a very heteronormative approach. So it is the first three phases that are of particular interest in Freud's theory.